Tonight we continue our winter-spring, feeling much more like the spring half of that, lecture series with Ignacio Bunster, the principal of WRT in Philadelphia. And in thinking about Ignacio's presentation and his role in this, our theme of practice, it got me going through my archives, not only to help clean out my office, but to help frame some things. And whether he will admit to it or not, I came across an article that Ignacio used to participate in monthly in ASLA magazine, which was a kind of, two perspectives on a topic. And this one happened to be on the issue of sustainability. And Ignacio's response to this debate about sustainability and what its role was it doesn't matter what its role is, it's critical, it's fundamental. And this was longer ago than either he or I would care to admit. So, and what I think that's evidence of is that Ignacio's is a voice that has really been active in shaping the discourse for a landscape in really all of its critical areas. He has been recognized as a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University. He is a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. He studied under Ian McHarg at the University of Pennsylvania. And as principal at WRT, his firm has received numerous national honor and merit awards from the American Society of Landscape Architects. And going back to this idea of his voice in the profession, mostly through the Urban Land Institute and his presentations and essays, he has really been one of the formative voices for the ideas of discourse around landscape urbanism, and I think those are things that you will see in the work that we see tonight. So, as he has framed his lecture tonight, beyond design with nature, you can't help but imagine what he's charging himself with, but also asking us as educators and students in the practice of landscape architecture to pursue ourselves in this new environment where these issues that he has long been invested in are now the center of what we do. So with that, I welcome Ignacio Bunster-Ossa to the KSA and look forward to his presentation.
Thank you, Jason, and honestly, thank you so much for having me here. This actually is an interesting moment for me to come here, only because I'm in the process of exploring some new ideas about practice and the profession, which is really the subject of the lecture today, which I have not given before. So I have to labor intensely to try and put something cogent together. I'm not sure I'll succeed, but I thought it would be good at least to share with you and engage you in this discussion about what lies beyond design and nature. First, a few things about myself. I've been with WRT for 32 years. They plucked me out of Penn to join them. It's been a while. I've been a principal for 20 of those years in the firm. I have worked in every single one of our offices, lived and worked around the country in California, Dallas, Miami, and Philadelphia, where I'm currently based. I've had the privilege of doing work in 15 different countries in this time. So it's been quite a ride. And I think one of the reasons that I came to this firm to begin with is the scope, the reach of the work, how comprehensive it is, from planning on the one side to architecture and landscape architecture and urban design on the others. Actually, it's little known that about 50% of our work in terms of revenue is actually architecture, with a specialty in housing, both mixed use and subsidized housing. Now, within this sphere, my work tends to focus on the urban environment and the ability for landscapes to leverage places, this one in Nashville, Courthouse Square, parks, this one of Rick Espy here from MSI is very familiar with this project since we worked together for years on this in California, or streets anything that brings people together and creates dynamics by which cities specifically can become sustainable. That's been my focus for really most of this incredible time in the office. This is not my work. This is the cover of the Central Artery in Boston, the Rose Kennedy Greenway. We lost this project. We came in second to AECOM or EDO at the time. We were teamed up with West 8. And I only show you this because in my profession, in hopefully your profession, you lose probably more than you win. If you're batting anywhere between 300 and 400, you're doing really well. So I will try, and we missed a lot, a lot of whiffs. So I will focus on the few hits that we had that I think have been success stories. The first one is in Georgetown in Washington. And I'm going to share, really focus on 3 projects today, try to describe them briefly, and then try and frame them in the context of these new ideas that I was mentioning. This project is a narrow band that faces the Potomac River at the foot of Georgetown, which is a hill town, of course. You can see the relationship to the Kennedy Center for the Arts and the mall and so forth. And this is the case where, historically, of course, Georgetown preceded the creation of the nation's capital. Like Philadelphia, Trenton, and even Tuscaloosa in Alabama, these are cities that were created, or towns were created, are the farthest navigable reach of the rivers that basically descend down from Appalachia. And this is where it's called the Falls, the Lime Falls. And this is where this place grew up. And it was a place where schooners and ships came forth and to pick up tobacco and various other products to take back to the old world. Now, in time, it became an industrial site, power plants, tanneries, cement plants, and things of that sort. Eventually, they decided to put a highway between the waterfront and the town. And then that's what we inherited as a site, basically a parking lot. This is a national park. Same category run by the same folks that run Yellowstone. But this is the only waterfront urban park in the nation. And so it was quite a challenge to work on this, particularly working with a very diverse community within Georgetown, also the capital, the National Capital Planning region, people, National Park Service, and so it was quite involved mechanics of designing this thing. And I will briefly share with you kind of what were some of the key issues that we had to confront. This project was dedicated in 2 phases, the last one back in September of last year. It took from 2002 to 2011 to become a reality. And basically that's strictly a question of funding. And frankly, you wonder what it takes to spend actually it was closer to $20 million in the context of a national park, in the context of everything else that the government does. Of course, half the money had to come from private sources, which was part of the deal. And this is where the story gets interesting, because as a designer, we were so focused on the image on the left, which had to do with the historical waterfront wharf history of the place. The community was interested in the image of the right, which is the more beautiful garden tradition that exists in Georgetown. That's an image from Dumbarton Oaks, that famous garden that exists at the top of the hill. So really the challenge was to somehow figure out a connection between these 2 things to see what could happen in terms of a resonant design for people there. The garden aspect of this was fairly straightforward and easy. We partitioned the site in ways that responded to the city grid, but also a sense of waviness or lines of paths that created a different perspective, a more angular perspective to the river, which lengthened the perception of the park as opposed to just looking at it perpendicular from the highway over to the left to the waterfront. And it's quite successful. The plant material that you see there is a combination of rain gardens and other features that hold the water. Not a drop of water exits this site without getting filtered by the various plants that you see there. And one of the big achievements is that there is no railing on this park, even though it's a 10-foot drop to the water. There's instead the vegetation. It's about a 8 to 12 foot of band of vegetation that keeps people out, and it's quite different in terms of being an urban park. Typically, you expect to see the hardened edge. This was a departure from that had to do with the idea of the garden, except for a few spots where people are invited to really take a perch close to the water. And very simple materiality. We just didn't want anything extraneous, even though members of the community were really desiring of the wrought iron, bricky kind of more traditional materials. It was a hard fight to win over that. And then we figured out ways in which to create some unique features. That circle there is in fact a labyrinth that was privately funded by a foundation that specializes, believe it or not, in labyrinths in Washington, D.C. It's called the Sacred Space. People do all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect in a labyrinth. There are those that do follow the line work to get to the center. But some people do meditate, and in fact the bench that you see there was part of the donor, what the donor wanted to put up there, and it's a bench designed out of old pickle barrels or casks. And you might see that there's a little pocket underneath the bench, and in that pocket there's a book, and people can go in there and write in the book any thought about anything that they wish to write. And so people do that, and it's quite interesting to follow. These are published on the web, and you can begin to see a way for people to connect to the landscape, to connect to the environment in very personal ways, not in a kind of sense of public way, even though it's in a public environment. So that was quite an interesting thing. Now this feature here was designed by artist Jody Pinto, whom we were working with. Rick also knows her very well. Jody's a New York City artist, and we always try to work and engage artists in our work. It's part of a central idea and philosophy about design. And in this case, the idea was to really recreate the sense of the historic waterfront in an abstract way, the masts, the lineworks, the sails. It did not pan out. This was one that was rejected by the community, and instead we had to design, without her participation, a different kind of feature in this projection shot into the waterfront. These are basically granite panels that incorporate seating, etched with imagery of the place. The little wavy things that you see there are raised granite stone pieces that attempt to keep skateboarders away, which is one of the things that is always a concern in anything you design in a public environment. And so this was a case which is part of the theme that I'm going to touch on today, the role of art and how you have to negotiate sometimes the things that artists do or don't do in these kinds of things. Jody also designed this kind of wavy pergola that was supposed to be a fiberglass material that's transparent, including fiberglass benches. And it also did not pan out, but we did keep the idea alive until the very end. And so this is supposed to be a pergola. It was just installed, as I mentioned, last year, so the plants haven't yet been able to grow up on it. But it's there as a way to imagine a kind of waterfront that has to do with the expression and the capture of a seaside environment, clouds and so forth, being in a different place. That's also structurally, from a material point of view, rather stark, not decorative, that picks up the elemental qualities of being on the ocean and on a ship. And the fountain here was something that was quite interesting to design. It's a very simple fountain, really. There's nothing mechanically difficult about it. The jets don't move in any way, but it's supposed to come out of a big chunk of stone that you see back there to create the form of a wave, as if a wave were coming up. And it's quite enjoyable for the kids. So that's one project that I think was a real test of how do you work with community, how do you engage communities to fund something that they can support, how do you test against the community that wants something different than you as a designer, and clearly as an artist in this case, need to put forward. And there's a whole dynamic about that I think I could bore you to tears with, but nonetheless it's so important in our profession to be able to negotiate those kinds of encounters and what the role of the designer and what the role of the community is in those regards. It's interesting, this image of Georgetown we saw after the design had been cooked, in fact had already under construction, and I began to notice the projection of people on the water, this kind of stone monuments rising up, clearly the ship, and when it was all said and done, the design picked up on a lot of these features, unbeknownst to really us in any way. And I think it's something about how you enter the process of design by getting so immersed into the soulfulness of a place and its historical qualities to be able to absorb internally what might come out in terms of design. And that's an exercise I think that it's very difficult to do in practice because typically clients don't pay you to do that. You simply have to do it on your own time, go research, go to the historical societies, visit the site, be part of that environment for quite a while before you begin to sort of absorb these qualities that you can pick up in design. Okay, number 2, the story of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. This is the site that produced the steel for everything you see here on the screen, including, and many more things throughout the country. Many people credit the steel that came out of Bethlehem, PA, with winning the Second World War in terms of the Liberty ships, for example, that were designed. The steel from the World Trade Center came from here. So there's an amazing amount of history that's embedded in the steel works in Bethlehem, which is about an hour and 15 minutes sort of due north of Philadelphia. This is the site. Let me think, a year and a half ago, exactly. And it's been lying fallow since the mid-1990s, when finally Bethlehem Steel closed the plant. And what happened is that there's been a number of efforts, including student work, developers and so forth, trying to build something up here. Finally, the city of Bethlehem began to sort of look at this as a tax increment financing district and came up with a plan to bring art as a specific program to revitalize and bring people to the place. Our work was to design that plaza that you see there in green in front of the stacks, as it's called, the steel stacks. And the program had to do with TV studio, TV39, and a not-for-profit art organization called ArtsQuest, a new visitor center which repurposes one of the buildings, and a festival hall for concerts on the far side, those two buildings are now currently, as we speak, under construction. The plaza was supposed to have an amphitheater donated by the Levitt Foundation. They basically provide funds to bring free performances, free concerts to public parks with the proviso that people have to lay in the grass. They don't want permanent seating, they don't want anything of that sort. The big sugar daddy here really was the casino, the Sands. Without the profit that the casino makes, there would be no tax increment financing district here. And it's one of those really tough questions for me and a lot of professionals. The source of the funds, where does it come and what it means socially to have to tap these sources to create and make an improvement. Credit to them though that the casino was fairly sensitively designed as to kind of fit in with the environment. So one of the things that had to be done was to curve the street that went through there so that there would be enough room for the amphitheater to exist. And it had to be lined up with this street. Our office designed the building and the landscape. It was one of those landscape architecture collaborations, I think fairly successful. And it has a capacity for about 1,200 or so people. There are 60 free concerts a year. Behind this image to the right is the ArtsQuest building, and they have their own set of concerts. And off to the left, behind the building there, they erect huge stages for 5,000 to 10,000 people performances several times a year. So it's quite a venue. And because it's about equidistance from New York City to Philadelphia, more or less, it draws an awful lot of people. So it's a huge boon now to Bethlehem in terms of picking up and doing this. The stacks are lit up in the background. And in fact, the design of the wall that you see there, which is a sloping wall, is part of the lighting system. We didn't want any lights, any fixtures or poles or anything else in the way of the view of the stacks. So working with L'Osservatorio International, a lighting company in New York City, came up with the idea of lights that would reflect off of the concrete surface of that. It's about a 3.5-foot rise to be able to get the pitch down to the amphitheater. And there you see the lit pavilion. Some of the ideas there. Those sort of wickets, they look like staples, are in fact also light fixtures. They're basically simple fluorescent tubes that you can buy anywhere, Lowe's, Home Depot, attached to this frame that creates kind of a special glow in the landscape. And there's a little playground and other things there that can begin to provide some amenity while there are no performances going on. I mean, it's truly an amazing site in terms of having this as a backdrop there. That thing is an art piece. We were participants of trying to get a grant to bring art into this thing. It's not quite the art that I typically try to engage. We like art pieces that are much more integrated with all design. But the client was steadfast in getting somebody that worked with fire. And this woman out of New York, Elena Colombo, does work with fire. And she came up with all kinds of ideas about this thing. And in the end, it was this kind of beam of Corten steel that hovers over the road. It's about 20 feet up in the air, so trucks and fire trucks can get by. And it has a slit in the middle, out of which the fire comes out. So it's a very unique thing. In fact, Corten steel is everywhere on this site, even in the approach to the passages that take you into the amphitheater, and the bolts, and sometimes even the inscriptions of where the thing was manufactured. So we wanted to keep it absolutely consistent with the idea of the ruggedness expressed in this thing. So it's been quite a story. I think if you have any chance to go visit this place, it's an amazing place. And sometimes you see retired workers from the steel plant. They come now here and sit looking at this for hours. To them, this is a sacred place. What they did and what they feel they did in terms of providing support to the war, to the country in various ways, to them is almost a religious kind of experience. Now this is where, for me, the story begins to get interesting, because I grew up, in terms of my education, with Ian McCarty. And the idea of design with nature cannot be any farther removed from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, if you look at purposing a site that has major cultural heritage qualities. It is toxic like all get out. We couldn't implement any best management practices because we couldn't get water to penetrate into the toxic layer. So we were hamstrung in so many ways. And yet this is the legacy of the firm, and this is my own beginning in landscape architecture. And I want to digress a little bit to share with you, well, what this meant at the time, and the work that was done in the name of design with nature. This is one of the famous projects that the firm did back in, gosh, 1970-something, Amelia Island, and it was before 69. And the reason I know that is because the method used in this project in terms of locating buildings and other improvements in a pristine landscape led to the processes by which the National Environmental Protection Act was created. In terms of layering, suitability constraints, and things that sort of came from here. And of course, anyone that's ever done an environmental impact statement would recognize the method that was employed here. So it was pioneering in every conceivable respect. What it did is preserve the dunes on the one side, preserve the wetlands on the other side, and in the Mesic forest in the middle, placed some of this building. And then there was this one, which is written about in Design with Nature, and I recently got a call from Carl Steinitz at Harvard that wants to use this project for an upcoming book that he's writing. And he's one of the old great all-time greats in terms of landscape planning. And so even to this day, this project is regarded as being so current and important. It was a valley of agricultural land by well-to-do owners of the land, and they wanted to keep development at bay, but make some money out of it. I won't bore you with the details, but it lies about 10 miles due northwest of Baltimore. It's even beyond the beltway of Baltimore. You can see the line there. And that's as big as, look at the size of the land compared to downtown Baltimore. It's many times bigger than that. And then there was, well, here the idea was, these are some of the original drawings of creating clusters of development, trying to fit development in the woodlands, preserve the limestone valleys for agricultural purposes and so forth. Nothing ever happened. That never got built. There were other conditions that dictated as to why that didn't happen. But here's another one that in the 1970s, the Woodlands New Community was one of those classic examples that is still written about because all the drainage was done in natural ways. There was no pipes involved in stormwater, and as you know, it rains a lot in Houston. Initially, there were modest buildings and houses like the one up top. Eventually, they began to get more and more valuable, and we began to see the little McMansions crop up everywhere. Now there's a big town center in here that wasn't there originally. But this is what I think leads me and I think many to wonder, what is the legacy of design with nature? The Woodlands is 30 miles north of, and well outside the Beltway in Houston. And we know, of course, what this has meant in terms of sprawl. These are maps that the U.S. Geological Survey does to map out the growth of cities in the 22 years from 1970 to 1992. It has grown this much. It's interesting, I don't know if you can see the numbers there in red, I guess they're not visible, but Boston metro area has grown proportionally much more than Houston, which is shocking. It's more sprawled, even though the population has not grown as fast. But that's really the idea that if you can do your planning correctly, following NEPA, you can do this. And you can build your highways financed by the government to put people out there. It's not the purpose of this talk to tell you about, well, what impact this has on climate and so on and so forth. It's been well documented in areas, I'm sure. This is just one good book that if you want to learn about the health impacts of suburban development, you can follow. It's quite a compelling talk that Richard Jackson provides in this regard. But I think in the end, it's kind of irrelevant, the politics of sprawl. We cannot expect that the next doubling of the population will occupy as much land as they did in the past 50 years. No way, no how. And if nothing more than the limits of design, of land available for development is shrinking because of conservation efforts. There's less land available to build the next, or to house the next 200, 300 million people in this country. That might take 70, 80 years, but still, it's fast coming. And this is just one example. South Livermore Valley, off of the Bay Area there, people were getting tired of that kind of development that you see up there, the sort of 1 unit per 20 acres, or the golf course communities. And we did a plan about 15 years ago that began to concentrate the development in specific parcels closer to the town that was there, closer to the transit lines. And the end result was something like this, creating a new agricultural environment. Those are new olive groves, there's vineyards embedded in the housing development as the landscape of the development. And you can see that there's quite a bit of densification that occurred because of this. Less land, more density, and so on and so forth. Even this is not enough. This is what that development up in the upper area looks like. And it's about 3 units to the acre instead of 1 unit per 20 acres. A big achievement there, but it's not enough. We're going to have to start looking at models that are in the 30, 40, 50 dwellings per acre, FARs of 3, perhaps 4. We don't have to go to the scale of New York City, but we have to go to the scale if we have any hope of achieving a certain sustainable matrix in cities throughout the nation. So the question is, if you build it, will they come? What does it take to get people excited about these kinds of environments? I hate to tell you, it's not the architecture. It's not how well designed, and this one was designed by Grant Solomon. He was a principal in our office for a number of years. It has to do with what I call this idea of beyond design with nature. Putting the green infrastructure, addressing what I call localism, which is working in specific places with specific people about specific issues that affect them in a public engagement process. And third, and very importantly, public art. I don't think that there's hardly been enough done in terms of addressing the integration of public art throughout. There's many programs that present for art and so on and so forth. Very uneven, very difficult, and very sporadic, I should say, in achievement of quality. So one of the things that I'm trying to address is how do you integrate these three things within an ecological model? And that's the basic question that I'm trying to address. We have changed the landscape. It's an urban landscape, and that is changing us. We are now much more focused on urban environments, and the urban nature, the things that we care about and do in this environment is very different than it has been historically. And this poses the fundamental question, what do we do with things like this? I mean, this is the legacy, if you've read Roderick Nash and Wilderness and the American Mind, it is so embedded as an ideal of the American dream. Somehow this access to this pristine nature which does not really exist. We admire things like this in Route 66. We focus on the buttes and so forth. We forget that this is part of the Jeffersonian grid that's throughout the country. It's part of an infrastructure that's everywhere. By the way, if you ever wonder where is the longest, straightest road in the country, it is in North Dakota, near Fargo, which is called Route 56, and runs for 120 miles, straight and narrow. One day I hope to go visit it. Near there, there's a place called the Prairie Pothole region, which is an amazing collection. It's a regional thing that comes off of Canada. It is the biggest concentration of waterfowl. It's a migratory landscape, remnant of glaciation that came down and created these potholes that get filled up with water, and just millions and millions of waterfowl come through here. Well, roads slice right through them. And so this idea of nature and infrastructure, I think, has to be looked at very carefully, especially by landscape architects. This is the landscape that we have created. It's dams and highways and canals and railroads and all this kinds of stuff. Oops, I don't know what happened there. So the point of all this is that we have really reversed the formula of thinking that we have lived surrounded by a natural environment. Now we have natural urban environments that surround little remnants of nature, important as they may be. And I think that the one here in Philadelphia, this is called the John Hines Natural Wildlife Refuge. It's about 1,000 acres. And you can see where it's at. It's surrounded by Philadelphia International Airport. The yellow lines are interstate highways. The orange line is major northeastern rail lines for Amtrak and freight. The blue lines that fade are those are the flight paths of airports. And then there's even the dashed line takes you to the pipeline from a tanker port into a refinery. And yet this is what's left of what used to be a major delta of one of the big creeks that empties into the Delaware River. So, I use that to get to this project, which is the Trinity River Corridor project, which is really quite a stunning desire on the part of Dallas to turn a piece of infrastructure into a living landscape. And I think that if there's any future out there for the profession of landscape architecture, it is with infrastructure. And I think the more that we can begin to address what that is, working with all the engineers that are working with infrastructure, the more we can gain on this question of greenness in cities. This project also encompasses the very idea of what it is to have water in a fairly arid landscape. This is the symbol of the city of Dallas. It's Pegasus. And if you may recall your Greek mythology, Pegasus was sired by Poseidon, and it's reputed to have the ability with its hoofs to strike the ground and therefore allow water to spring forth and emerge. And it is the water of inspiration. It is the water that the muses use to be able to write poetry, develop art and music, and so on and so forth. This idea, believe it or not, is quite embedded in the psyche of people in Dallas. And when you think about the Trinity River, they think about this. They think about this historic painting in 1918 that creates this kind of out there wilderness as part of this river that no longer exists. It is the largest watershed in the state of Texas. It connects Dallas, Fort Worth with Houston. And there's major floods that happen here. This is an aerial photograph. You can see to the right is Dallas, to the left dot is Fort Worth. The two lines is the major runway pairs at DFW Airport. And the project site is the 7 miles of this floodway right that intersects almost downtown Dallas. It is part of a 10,000 acre parkland that includes some pristine bottomland forests on the bottom side. And this is the reason, in fact, why Dallas exists at all, is that when it was founded in 1840 something, they found a place where people could ford the river. They could actually walk across when it wasn't filled up with water because of shallow geology of limestone that was there. And so the idea of water and geology are embedded in why a city is where it is. There was a major flood in 1918 that wreaked havoc, and that created the idea that the Army Corps of Engineers should come in here and fix the problem, which they did. And the first thing they did is they relocated the river. They moved it 3 miles. They also began to build levees. You can see the old river to the right, and the levees beginning to emerge. The future levee would be there where that line is. And of course, to build the levees, you have to build bridges to be able to get one side to the other. Big, long bridges. They're more than ½ a mile in length. That's the landscape today. Of course, as soon as you encased the river, you created a lot of new land for development. A lot of industry came here in the first part of the century. Most of it today obsolete. And that's the landscape if you go there today. It's 2,000 feet of barren, floodplain, grassy vegetation, which has nothing to do with the idea of Pegasus that the city has in mind. In fact, when it floods, everybody sort of, it's a huge sigh of relief because water shows up. And sometimes you get this amazing view. This is obviously not my shot. I picked it up from Flickr somewhere, but you can tell what's happening in people's minds by the photographs they take. And people endeavor to rush to this place when there's water and capture it in kind of an artistic, otherworldly kind of sense. That's the Pegasus sitting on top of that building, looking up at it. So there's been a number of studies and plans and designs done for this. The previous incarnation was done by George Hargraves and Alex Krieger. We were hired after they did the initial plan to create a new park, dealing with all this infrastructure. And it had to, by design, address recreation, ecology, flood protection, transportation, and economic development. You can't do anything in Texas without having a highway somewhere in the mix. And so the highway had to come as a way to release pressures from the highways already, major highways encircling the downtown. And one of the things we had to do was to create design guidelines for that highway. As we were doing this, Santiago Calatrava was designing 2 new bridges that would cut across. In fact, he was supposed to design 5, but I think 2 is the number in the end that donors and the state transportation department can afford. And you see them there. And so the floodplain looks like this. We began to model ways in which it could be changed. One of our interests was to turn the highway into a major work of green infrastructure. So that's just one of the things we did. We put like 3,200 megawatt windmills. By virtue that it's on the levee, you already were gaining about 30 feet, which is the height of the levee, to the air currents that can power this stuff. And these are not the huge, 300-foot diameter blades. These are only 120 feet, which is much easier to deal with in an urban environment. There were lots of questions about birds. And we talked to the Audubon Society, and they said, don't worry about it. Birds birds are more worried about cats than they are about these things. But it nonetheless was a source of concern, because if the bird were to hit a blade, it might fall on somebody's windshield traveling at 60 miles an hour. All just diversion tactics not to put this stuff in there. It is in the books, it is in the guidelines, and I think there's lots of people interested to do this. It looks like a park, it smells like a park, it's lots of recreation, more than 40 miles of trails. But the big idea was the lakes. There's 3 of them. This one really is an Olympic rowing course. We're using these devices called solar bees. They're solar-powered devices that churn water so that you can keep the water circulating without the use of electricity, and they can float. There's like 4 of them throughout the lake. And then there's 2 other lakes that are important, what are being called the natural lake and the urban lake. They're fed by water from the treatment plant, so it's recycled water. 70 million gallons of water a day would come through here. And the pinch point is something we call the isthmus, because it's the connection between one body of water and the other. The natural lake, of course, is what it is. And we work very closely with John Todd, Ecological. They are one of the pioneers of using floating wetlands, or using wetlands to treat water. And so you have these circles, there's about 120 of them planned for here, that would take the water from the treatment plant and further polish it. And it's all floating plant material. The root zones begin to capture the phosphate, the nitrate, and things of that sort. And also creates a fish and habitat for fishing and so forth. That's what the things can look like. And then the urban lake, of course, is what it is, and it's much more about recreation activity, people gathering, fireworks, 4th of July festivities and the like. But the whole thing has to flood. And so we calculated the umbrellas in such a place that when the floods came, they could almost appear like water lilies in this. And they were lit up. This is all solar fabric, so that they would have basically no electrical conduit coming to it. It would just be self-powered. And by the way, that's one of the Calatrava bridges on the top that will be dedicated to the public in a month. The isthmus is a place of interest. We work with artist Brad Baumer. He's a specialist in working with limestone in Dallas. He's a Dallas-based artist. He works all over the world, but he lives there. And the idea was to create a place that could be forded, that could be really walked over from side to side, using the local limestone to do that, but also allowing passages for kayakers and things of that sort. So it begins to be kind of the center for the very idea that you can be in this river, you can habitate this river in new ways, but recalling the very nature of the place when the city was founded more than 150 years ago. What's of interest here is not the recreation stuff that I just showed you, but in fact 82% of the site is some kind of natural environment. Whether it's a wetland, a woodland, meadow, lakes, riparian. The river, for example, is taking out of a straight line, is given a new meandering quality. It's being lengthened by about 3/4 of a mile because of the meanders. And working with a number of engineers, creating an embankment situation that allows for new habitat, so that it works as a wildlife corridor, connecting that big forest that I showed you before with this thing here. This is the only instance I know of any city moving a river twice. But it has yet to be done, so you don't know. What's of interest here is that this is one of the flood images. When you put water in a floodway, what happens hydrologically is that the coefficient of resistance for water, new water, to move over it decreases dramatically. So you're going to speed up floodwaters as you move it over water. And the Army Corps of Engineers won't let you do that because then you provide impact downstream. So you have to find a way to resist the water, create a hardened coefficient, and the only way to do that is through trees. So in a floodplain where you have almost no trees, there's more than 19,000 of them that are being planted here. And that's the impact of 19,000 trees. I mean, it's not that much if you think about it in terms of carbon sequestration, but it's a big chunk, it helps. And I think one of the things that you can always think about in landscape architecture is what is the impact to these kinds of serious issues that we have to live with. There's more than 300 acres of wetlands that are being created with new vegetation, and that's the impact of that. Wetlands actually are far more efficient in trapping carbon than trees. Of course, they produce methane, which is a problem, but I think scientists are still trying to figure out the cost-benefit of that particular thing. And then even more interesting is that if you think of this, now you put this amenity, you're going to attract development. We calculated that there's about a square mile of potential redevelopment as a result of the lands that would be leveraged by this project. And if you take that times the density that I showed you, about 30 people to the acre, you end up with 100,000 population here, which is 10 times more than currently live in downtown Dallas. So if you really want to have an impact on sustainability, it's not about more efficient cars, it's about concentrating people around an amenity that they would want to live by, enjoy, and create just a different kind of city than exists there. It's easier to do, of course, in the Southwest, in the Midwest, where you have land in the city to do it. Statistically, you would be saving 2 lives a year. And maybe that doesn't mean much, but if it were yours, it would mean a lot. And what this did, it began to attract development. This is one developer out of San Diego that came to our office looking for a way to really span the levees, span the highway, and come forward and create a waterfront environment in Dallas where there is none today. We happily obliged. That's part of the design of the park. We're interfacing with this development. Other developers across the way are beginning to look at the same kinds of things. UT Texas, I don't know, Jason, if you were there when they did this. They have a studio in Dallas every year. They did some urban design plans there. You can begin to see the impact of infrastructure, green infrastructure in the city. What we really tried to do from the beginning was to tell the city and tell everyone, it's not about the park itself, but it's about projecting this infrastructure out into the urban environment, what we call Parks Without Borders. It's about the corridors of connectivity and even to development parcels per se. That's the new Calatrava Bridge that will be dedicated in a few weeks. And the bridge next to it is called the Continental Bridge, and it will be abandoned because it's no longer serviceable or needed as a transportation corridor. So we've been doing designs to turn it into a pedestrian way, almost like a High Line, but a la Dallas. And it's about 50 feet wide, about 2,000 feet long. And it's already it's going to go into construction probably sometime in the summer this year. It's one of the issues of green connectivity. The old sumps, the old river, people are taking designs to create trails and bring new housing attached to that. We have done designs for all the major streets surrounding and framing basically the floodway using complete and green street models. And this for me is where it gets so interesting because it's about going from the regional use of landscape for infrastructure such as water in this case to the rooftops of those buildings. And so what connects the two, I think, is the important thing. You have to use systems thinking, I think, that engages architecture, planning, landscape architecture, in all these kinds of concerns to make a wholeness out of the thing. This is all work we do except for the green wall. I'd love to do one, I haven't done one yet. But it's about the green roofs, the terraces, the indoor ventilating green walls, It's taking that to the street level, it's taking that to the bikeways, to the big parks, in one consistent application that applies systems thinking on energy, water, air, quality, noise, cultural heritage, and so on and so forth. And then we get to this. I mean, this is good stuff. I mean, no reason not to have algae farms in rooftops. Actually, we would be far better off putting algae farms in rooftops than solar panels in terms of energy production and impact that way. All this stuff exists. This is not things that are being tested out in labs. This is all proven technology. I keep thinking, what would happen if this country spent what they spent in highways doing this kind of stuff? Where would we be in 50 years? Even stuff like biotrophic treatment plants. I mean, this stuff is invented by John Todd. I mentioned it's a toilet. Basically, it brings your wastewater from your toilet and treats it in a tank on your rooftop. No reason not to do that. But we cannot forget, and this is for me the main point, that ecology is not strictly about green stuff. If you follow the writings of Leibniz, if you follow the critique of Gilles Deleuze in The Fall and the Baroque, for example, you realize that ecology is also about what's in the mind. It's the mind and body unity, which is perhaps an anti-enlightenment idea. Well, let's get rid of the enlightenment for a minute and think about ways in which we can connect these two things. What's in the heart, what's in the mind, as ideas to bring forward. And I come back to this image of the potholes in North Dakota. This is a landscape that has been severely tested and impacted by agriculture. And yet it exists in the minds of people in Fargo as an ideal place that is so close to the soul, so close to the heart, that it deserves a place in design. This project called Fargo 365 is a winning competition entry that 4 of our staff in Philadelphia did for an urban block in Fargo. And the name comes from the idea that you can occupy a space, public space, and a building 365 days a year in a climate that really is not easily conducive to that. You can begin to see things like, I don't know if I can, there we go, little potholes here and there. They're using them for water retention, for BMPs, to absorb and filtrate water, also to create amenity within the plaza. Artwork is incorporated as part of a digital display, interactive with people. So the idea of localism and art and infrastructure beginning to be folded all in one. There you see sort of the summer scene. It's difficult in this project to really identify, well, where does architecture begin, or where does landscape begin and architecture end, and vice versa. It is so embedded one with the other, functionally as good infrastructure, but also from the art perspective and the spiritual perspective of recognizing something about a landscape that's dear to these folks. And then in winter time, where they do use geothermal pumping to be able to defrost the plazas and create a microclimate that you can use year-round. And I have to think that more of the future of American cities rests on projects like this, where you begin to sort of fuse the lines between what is architecture, what is landscape architecture, through the lens of green infrastructure and ecology as a house with 2 floors, if you will, the spiritual and the body. We have to go back, I think, to the Baroque to understand this sense of unity that I'm describing here. And if you read Deleuze's work, I mean, he has some important things to say, such as Baroque painting, or I'm not going to read it, but it's the idea that sculpture, architecture, and city planning are all part of a continuum. They're not divided cleanly. And the buildings inside and outside begin to project and express this continuity. And furthermore, that what he calls continuity of the arts. And for me, the key phrase is that thing of a matter that moves through it. This is both a physical and a spiritual matter. in the Baroque that moves through the work. Is the intent of the Counter-Reformation through this sort of grandiose architecture and art. But in this case, we can translate that to be, well, what if the matter is green infrastructure coupled with this localness that can be looked at in every condition? And what does it mean to unify the arts, city planning, architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, engineering, into something that's cohesive, that begins to advance visions for the cities of the future? When I took this picture, I didn't realize I was grass growing on the railing. I think it was quite present, and I regret that it has been taken down. Anyway, I leave you with this. I think that's the quote from the book that I enjoy the most. I think it has to do with this idea that we cannot forget about the poetics of design, the source of form, as you begin to address the questions of sustainability, which were not addressed, I think, in Design with Nature, in terms of conceptually looking at habitat as something of the mind. Thank you.